Every time I come out here, Vinny's doing a job and you're holding his hand.
Me and him split everything. We started yesterday.
Get your hands dirty for a change. Do some welding and grinding instead of watching everybody else do.
Every bike that needs to get built gets done. Everybody's working at all times. And you know what? 10 years. This is the kind of stuff we've been dealing with for 10 years.
There's a moment people who grew up watching Discovery Channel in the early 2000s can still picture without trying. A quiet garage in upstate New York, sparks flying off a grinder, and a young man hunched over a gas tank like it's the only thing that matters in the world. That young man was Paul Teutul Jr., and for a decade, he was the calm, focused heartbeat inside one of the loudest, most explosive father-son relationships television has ever broadcast. To understand how a kid who once swept metal shavings off a shop floor became a household name, and then walked away from the very company that made him famous, you have to go back to where it all started. A steel shop, a hard man, and a boy who just wanted to build something beautiful. Paul Michael Teutul was born on October 2nd, 1974, the oldest of 4 children raised by Paul Teutul Sr. and his first wife, Paula. While other kids his age were spending summers at the pool or losing themselves in cartoons, Paul Jr. was already learning his way around a fabrication shop. His father ran Orange County Iron Works, a steel business built on discipline, long hours, and zero patience for excuses, and from an early age, that world became Paul Jr.'s classroom. By his early teens, he was already putting in real hours at the shop, sweeping floors, running tools, watching the older guys weld. It wasn't the kind of childhood most people would choose for their kids, but it gave him something most people never get: a genuine hands-on understanding of steel, structure, and design years before he ever touched a motorcycle. He wasn't just absorbing a trade. He was absorbing a way of seeing the world, one where a raw piece of metal could become almost anything if you had the patience and the eye for it. His father wasn't an easy teacher. Paul Sr. had a reputation, even within his own family, for being tough, blunt, and quick to anger, and that reputation didn't soften just because the person on the other end of it was his son. If anything, it went the other way. Paul Jr. has said in interviews over the years that he often felt he was held to a harder standard than anyone else on the crew, precisely because he was the boss's kid. That dynamic, a demanding father who ran hot, and a son who preferred to work quiet and precise, would define their relationship for the next 3 decades, on camera and off. Eventually, Paul Jr. rose to lead the railing division at Orange County Iron Works, a part of the business that, by his own account, became one of its most successful. He wasn't handed the position for free. He earned it by producing work that customers wanted and were willing to wait for. It was proof, long before reality television ever entered the picture, that he had real talent, not just a famous last name. Somewhere in the late 1990s, Paul Sr., who had always kept one foot in motorcycles as a personal hobby, decided to get back into building bikes, and he wanted his son's help. What started as something closer to a side project between a father and son quickly turned into something bigger. In 1999, Paul Sr. officially founded Orange County Choppers in the small hamlet of Rock Tavern, New York, about 60 miles north of New York City, and Paul Jr. came on board as lead designer and fabricator. Their first bike together, later nicknamed True Blue, took months of long nights to finish. It was raw, ambitious, and unmistakably different from the factory-built cruisers most people were used to seeing. When they brought it to Daytona Bike Week in 1999, it turned heads in a scene that had seen just about everything. It was a small, early signal that they had built something worth paying attention to, though at that point, neither of them had any idea how far it would go. The early years of Orange County Choppers were lean. Money was tight. The shop was small and often freezing in the winter, and every custom order mattered because there wasn't much of a cushion if something went wrong. It was, by all accounts, hard, unglamorous work, the kind that tests a business partnership as much as it tests a father-son relationship. In many ways, it was already testing both. In 2002, a television producer named Craig Peligian, who had seen a magazine feature on their bikes, approached the Teutuls about doing a reality show. According to accounts from the family, Paul Sr.'s first reaction to the pitch was not exactly enthusiastic. Early concepts reportedly involved restoring old bikes rather than building from scratch, which didn't sit right with either of them. Eventually, a different pitch emerged. Cameras would simply follow the real process at Orange County Choppers, arguments included. That version stuck. American Chopper premiered in 2002 on the Discovery Channel, and within a remarkably short time, it became appointment television for millions of viewers. The show didn't hide the shop's tension. If anything, that tension became part of the appeal. Viewers tuned in for the outrageous custom builds, but a lot of them stayed for the dynamic between a hot-tempered father and a son who, more often than not, absorbed the yelling and kept working. Orange County Choppers went from a small custom shop to a nationally recognized brand almost overnight. Merchandise, model kits, and licensing deals followed, and the company eventually moved into a much larger facility to keep up with demand. Paul Jr., in particular, became a fan favorite. Footage of him quietly working on a gas tank, completely absorbed in the process with no dialogue at all, became some of the most memorable television the show ever produced. A reminder that underneath the yelling and the drama, there was genuine craftsmanship happening. Motorcycle and welding schools reportedly saw a bump in interest during those years, something people close to the show sometimes referred to as the Paulie effect. Long before the fire bike or the courtroom battles, there was the Black Widow, the very first build featured on American Chopper, spread across the two-part series premiere that aired in late March and early April 2003. Paul Jr. designed it, spiderweb motifs and all, as a chopper built for a New York bike show, and it marked something else too. It was the first major build Paul Jr. and fellow fabricator Vinny DiMartino worked on together, the start of a working relationship that would carry through most of the show's run. The Black Widow gave viewers their first real look at Paul Jr.'s design sensibility, a taste for dark, intricate theming that would recur throughout his career. And by 2025, the original bike had found a permanent home in the showroom at Paul Jr. Designs, a small full-circle detail from a show that began with him and has, in some sense, ended up back in his hands. It's easy to forget, looking back, just how large American Chopper actually got. At its peak, the series pulled in more than 3 million viewers per episode, making it the highest-rated program on the Discovery Channel at the time and turning a small custom shop in Rock Tavern into a recognizable national brand almost overnight. The original run stretched from 2003 to 2010 across roughly 200 episodes, before the show was quietly canceled by TLC amid declining ratings and the escalating real-life tension between father and son. It didn't stay gone for long. Discovery revived it later that same year as American Chopper Senior vs. Junior, a title that made explicit what the original series had only implied. Along the way, the network aired a pair of unusually candid specials, A Family Divided and A Crew Divided, in which the Teutul's and their respective crews spoke directly about just how dysfunctional things had actually become behind the scenes. The spin-off era ran through 2012, when the series finally ended for good after roughly a decade on the air. Though Discovery would bring the Teutul's back together for occasional specials in the years that followed, evidence that audiences never entirely lost their appetite for the family story. Of everything Orange County Choppers built during the American Chopper years, one bike stands apart from the rest. Not because of its price tag or its shock value, but because of what it was built to honor. In 2003, the shop built what became known as the Fire Bike, a tribute to the firefighters who died on September 11, 2001. Every detail on that bike was chosen to carry meaning, right down to hundreds of hand-painted emblems representing the fallen. A piece of steel recovered from the World Trade Center wreckage was incorporated directly into the build. The bike went on to be shown at events across the country and became something close to a rolling memorial, a piece the FDNY and 9/11 families treated with real reverence. Years later, Paul Jr. would return to that same subject with a second tribute build, unveiled in January 2011, this time in partnership with the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. One version stayed as a permanent tribute. The other was raffled off, with proceeds going to support the memorial itself. It's one of the clearer examples of how the Teutul's work occasionally moved past spectacle into something genuinely meaningful to the public. Even as Orange County Choppers grew into a household name, the relationship between Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. was fraying. Part of it was structural. In 2007, Paul Sr. gave his son a 20% ownership stake in the company, but retained full control himself. On paper, it looked like a reasonable arrangement. Father runs the business, son drives the design work. In practice, As Paul Jr.'s creative reputation grew and the media increasingly framed him as the true design talent behind the brand, resentment reportedly built on the other side of that arrangement. By 2008, according to both Teutul's own public comments over the years, the shop had become a genuinely difficult place to work. Arguments were frequent, and the show captured plenty of them, though those close to the production have suggested the cameras didn't catch everything. In September 2008, a dispute between father and son escalated into one of the most talked-about moments in the show's history, a heated, on-camera argument that ended with Paul Sr. firing his son in front of the crew. It became one of the most replayed clips associated with the series in the years since. What followed was messy. Paul Jr. briefly returned as a contractor to satisfy contractual obligations tied to the show, but by April 2009, the working relationship was effectively over for good. With Paul Jr. departing the company, he'd helped build from a basement shop into a national brand. The split didn't stay confined to the shop floor. In January 2009, in an effort to preserve their television deal and formalize their business relationship, father and son signed a letter agreement that included an option allowing Paul Sr. to buy out Paul Jr.'s 20% stake at fair market value, without spelling out exactly how that value would be calculated. Later that year, when the two couldn't agree on a valuation process, Paul Sr. moved to force the issue, suing to compel the buyout and separately seeking roughly $1 million in additional damages, on top of the disputed roughly $500,000 stock value, bringing the total dispute to well over $1 million. In April 2010, a New York trial court initially sided with Paul Sr., ruling that the buyout option was enforceable and ordering an appraisal process to determine the share's value. Paul Jr. appealed. In December 2010, New York's appellate division reversed that decision, ruling that the buyout clause was too vague to be legally enforced. Paul Jr. kept his ownership stake, and his father was unable to force him out of the company through the courts. It was, by any measure, a significant legal win for Paul Jr. Vindication after a very public and very personal fight had played out partly in a courtroom and partly on national television. Barred by a non-compete clause from building motorcycles for roughly a year, Paul Jr. didn't wait around. He pivoted into product design, working on a range of projects that had nothing to do with choppers, including a redesign for a Coleman camping grill and a public dog park. To keep his new venture, Paul Jr. Designs, afloat, he's described that period as one of the hardest stretches of his career. Starting over, with a new company, no motorcycles to build yet, and a fractured relationship with the man who taught him the trade in the first place. When the non-compete expired in 2010, Paul Jr. didn't just quietly start building bikes again. Several key members of the Orange County Choppers crew, including longtime employees and his own younger brother Michael, left OCC to join him. It was, by any definition, a significant blow to his father's company and a clear signal of where loyalties within the old crew had settled. Discovery Channel, sensing there was still a story to tell, launched American Chopper, Senior versus Junior in 2010, framing the two shops as direct rivals. The two Teutuls faced off in build competitions over the following years, and by most accounts Paul Jr. won the majority of those head-to-head contests, a detail that, fairly or not, only added to the narrative of a son who had stepped out from his father's shadow and built something that could stand entirely on its own. While the business side of his life was in upheaval, Paul Jr.'s personal life was moving in a very different direction. He met Rachel Biester during a shoot for the show, and the two were married in August 2010. Paul Sr. did not attend the wedding, a detail that, given how raw the legal fight still was at the time, became its own quiet symbol of how far apart father and son had drifted. In his own public comments and in his 2016 memoir, The Build, Designing My Life of Choppers, Family and Faith, Paul Jr. has spoken candidly about how his faith reshaped his outlook during this period, helping him process both the business fallout with his father and his own personal growth as he moved into a new chapter of adulthood. In 2015, he and Rachel welcomed their son, Hudson. Paul Jr. has said becoming a father gave him a different, more sympathetic understanding of his own father, an appreciation for just how difficult it must have been for Paul Sr. to watch his son walk away, even amid all the anger on both sides. By the early 2010s, Paul Jr. Designs had grown into a genuine success story in its own right. producing custom motorcycles, branded apparel, and licensed builds for major companies. Over the years, the shop has built machines tied to pop culture projects, including a bike created for Blizzard Entertainment's World of Warcraft franchise and another built for the 2016 film Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Out of the shadows. Meanwhile, Paul Sr. continued to run Orange County Choppers, later relocating operations to Florida, where the business now operates as the OCC Roadhouse and Museum. Both companies have continued largely on separate paths since the early 2010s. Paul Sr. has weathered his own share of business turbulence over the years, including additional lawsuits with other partners and well-documented financial struggles. Paul Jr., meanwhile, built Paul Jr. Designs into an operation with real staying power, one that has outlasted the reality TV cycle that first put both Teutul's in the public eye. While Paul Jr. was rebuilding on his own terms, his father's path after the cameras stopped rolling as consistently was considerably rougher. In 2018, Paul Sr. filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy in New York, listing roughly $1.8 million in assets against more than $1 million in liabilities, including tax debt to the town where his home sat. That same period brought foreclosure proceedings on his Montgomery, New York property and a separate fraud lawsuit from a former business partner, Thomas Derbyshire, who alleged Paul Sr. had misused investment funds meant for a planned television reboot. Orange County Choppers' merchandising arm also went through its own bankruptcy filing as the business, once a multi-million-dollar merchandising machine built on model kits and licensed gear, shrank considerably once the original show's ratings faded. Paul Sr. has continued building bikes and making media appearances in the years since, eventually relocating Orange County Choppers operations to Florida, but the financial and legal turbulence of that stretch stands in fairly sharp contrast to the steadier trajectory Paul Jr. carved out with Paul Jr. Designs over the same years. Contrary to how tabloid headlines sometimes frame it, the story of Paul Teutul Jr. and his father isn't a simple, unresolved tragedy. It's something messier and more human than that. In interviews and on his own podcast in recent years, Paul Jr. has described the relationship with his father in more measured terms. Not the constant warfare of the American Chopper years, but not exactly a close, easy bond either. He said in various conversations over the years that things are better than they once were. They're not fighting the way they used to, even if they're not spending holidays together the way some families do. It's a relationship still working itself out, one conversation at a time, rather than one frozen permanently in the anger of a single televised blow-up. Public appearances in more recent years, including joint appearances with his brother Michael and former OCC crew members like Vinny DiMartino at motorcycle events, and open conversations on Paul Jr.'s own podcast about rekindling relationships with his father, suggest a family still finding its way back towards something workable, even if it will likely never look like the picture-perfect reunion audiences might want. Paul Sr., for his part, has continued to make his own media appearances discussing his life and career, separate from his son's ventures. It's tempting, looking back at American Chopper, to reduce Paul Teutul Jr.'s story to a tidy arc. Talented son, tyrannical father, dramatic falling out, redemption. But the real version is less packaged than that. It's the story of a kid who learned to trade the hard way, in a shop where mistakes weren't tolerated and praise was rare. A young man who turned that discipline into genuine artistry and helped build one of the most recognizable brands in reality television. And an adult who had to fight, legally and personally, to hold on to what he'd built when the one relationship at the center of it all came apart on national television.